Out of Order Gun Rights Podcast, episode 119.
Honest citizens like you protect themselves every day. We talk about it every week on the Self-Defense Gun Stories podcast. Were these gun owners lucky, or did they have a plan? How should we defend the people we love? We discuss recent examples on the Self-Defense Gun Stories podcast. Put us in your pocket.
Welcome to the Out of Order Podcast, your window into the firearms community, exploring those shaping the future of our rights and protecting our lifestyle, laws, legal cases, activism, and self-defense in a candid and honest podcast for our brothers and sisters in arms. Here's your host, James Kalita.
Thanks for tuning in to episode 119 of the Out of Order Gun Rights Podcast. Show notes page for today's episode is outoforderjameskalita.com/119. Today's guest is DeBroosse, an attorney with Munitions Group and OhioGunLawyer.com. And today's sponsors are Scott Shot. Whether you are taking a class as a complete beginner or an experienced, highly competent shooter seeking an NRA instructor certification, Scott Shot classes are comfortable, friendly, and taught with a high instructor-to-student ratio. And by the Self-Defense Gun Stories podcast, weekly reports and commentary on civilian self-defense. Attorney DeBroosse, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. So you were one of the founders of the Munitions Group. Would you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, Munitions Law Group was the formation of a law firm and group of experts in the firearms industry that was formed about 2-3 years ago between my law partner Clay Cheshire and myself. Mr. Cheshire has got 20 plus years experience working in the firearms industry from a legal standpoint, and I have, I think, right around 11, if I remember correctly. So we said to each other, why not join forces and solely focus our legal abilities on this industry, and that's what we've done.
Excellent. And so what kind of, my listeners vary, in their knowledge of firearms. How complicated is firearms law? Is there enough to carry an entire practice?
There is. I always tell people, especially younger attorneys, they ask the question why. I said, look, firearms regulations cover every gamut of law that's out there. You die with a gun, it needs to be put through probate. You have a large collection, you need a plan for that collection. You want to start a gun business, there's business planning, there's mergers and acquisitions, there's regulatory compliance, there's international law, there's import law, there's export law, there's taxes that are firearms are subject to, they're specific to firearms. So it runs the gamut, from soup to nuts. That's what our firm does. Anything from tax preparation for excise tax of manufacturers all the way to assisting people with ITAR regulations and import and export issues.
Wow. So what inspired you to study law, and what specifically led you to firearms law?
That's a broad question. I was always kind of into politics growing up, and served in the United States military for many years. And in high school, my father always told me I like to argue, I should be a lawyer, and that always just kind of resonated with me. So that's just kind of path I went down. And then when I graduated law school, was in the wonderful year of 2008, and we all remember what happened in 2008. The economy was flush with jobs, and everybody had money, right?
Yeah, that's what
in reality, in reality, that's not the case. I believe it was almost, I know it was the month at least, might have been the week. I got licensed to practice law. Lehman Brothers announced its collapse, so there was just no jobs. They just didn't exist, which was fine by me. I wanted to start my own practice anyways, so that forced me to do it. I always tell my wife that necessity breeds entrepreneurship, and I believe that, and there was a necessity for it because I couldn't find work. So I started doing criminal defense, and very early on realized there was no attorney that solely focused on firearms, from soup to nuts, So I started going down the criminal defense route and did a lot of criminal defense in my younger years, and then started getting involved with the NRA, Highlands for Concealed Carry, and other organizations like that. and making great contacts in the industry. And eventually that led me to meeting my law partner and us launching the firm.
Wow. So you mentioned starting in defense, and I think a lot of gun owners think of themselves as law-abiding, and that you only need a criminal defense attorney if you're guilty. Otherwise, you can just sort of walk in, tell the prosecutor you're innocent, and everything will be fine. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, that statement's probably correct if you're Jussie Smollett, I guess. You can just walk in and tell the prosecutor you're innocent, and they'll dismiss 16 felony counts. But if you're not Jussie Smollett, that's not really true, right?
Right.
You know, I've defended many people that thought they were doing the right thing and ended up getting charged anyways. We represented a gentleman who pulled his firearm in defense of an innocent life. It wasn't his own. It was a young infant, and pulled the firearm, and he ended up getting charged with felony assault. He was looking at 11 years in prison, 3 years mandatory. And we took it to trial, and we won, and he didn't do a day in jail. But nevertheless, you know, he thought he was doing the right thing, and it turned out he wasn't, in the eyes of the law at least. So they decided to prosecute him, and that cost him tens of thousands of dollars in defense work. And he got lucky. You know, jury trial is always a roll of the dice. No matter how good of an attorney you have, that's just the way it is. You just never know what a jury's going to do. And we were able to successfully litigate that case and keep him out of prison, but, you know, at what cost to his family, you know. So
right.
That's something that the viewer should always remember, that, you know, just because you believe you're innocent or you're doing the right thing doesn't mean the law enforcement community is going to see it the same way.
Right. And you mentioned the expense, and how long did that process take from the time he used that firearm to the time that he was acquitted?
You know, the price I can't remember exactly. It was north of $40,000 or $50,000, which is cheap for a jury trial. It lasted 2 days, the trial itself. But from the time of the incident to its conclusion, probably 8 months to a year. I don't really remember off the top of my head, but that's pretty average. It can go on a lot longer, just depending on the facts.
Right, and that's something I just want to bring to people's attention. That's 8 months to a year where you're living with the stress of knowing you might go to jail.
Sure.
And, you know, it's probably an inconsequential thing, but you can't buy firearms while you're under an indictment, and makes looking for work rather hard. So
I believe he ended up selling his business to actually pay for the legal fees too. So it did impact his life, and that's not something you get back. You know, that money's gone forever. It impacted his, but you know, he's not in prison. So at the end of the day, that's what matters.
Yeah. So are there any pitfalls that listeners should be aware of that you encounter a lot that maybe firearms owners aren't aware of?
It depends on the state you're in, but I can speak from Ohio, and from an Ohio standpoint, we have a couple unknown laws. The most unknown law, actually, that's on the books is you have a duty to report immediately if you lose or have a firearm stolen to local law enforcement. Most people don't know that. The biggest thing with concealed carry, I find, is that people pull the firearms when they're really not justified in pulling that firearm. You know, you pull that firearm, you better be justified in using deadly force, because if you're not, you could get charged with assault or felonious assault like my client did. And I generally see that in the male population more so than the female population, between the ages of 25 and 45 roughly. But most of the concealed carry holders that end up hiring me, that's the situation, right? It's a gray issue. They pulled a gun. They thought they were doing the right thing, and it turns out that there was other options that they could have pursued, and so law enforcement decided to charge them.
Oh. And so the duty to report, you that's an interesting term you used, unknown laws. How does that happen? It's usually, I grew up in a state where gun laws in the press almost every day. They're always trying to pass more. But is it an old law that's been around a while, or it was a law that was passed that nobody talked about, or?
It's a law that I've never actually seen even enforced. It's just one of those off-the-wall laws that are on the books that most people don't know about, but that does exist. I don't know when it was passed. Like I said, I didn't know about it till years into my practice, because a client had told me about it. I just thought it was an interesting thing to mention to the listeners. It's not something that they should concern themselves with, because I generally have never seen it enforced. But that's an example of the types of laws that are out there that might be, hidden or unknown to the general public that they should be aware of.
And I think I heard you mention in one of the interviews I listened to that you teach a segment on when not to pull the gun. Is there any bits of that you might be able to share with us today?
I kind of covered it already. That case I had mentioned earlier is kind of what led me to revamping my legal presentation seminar that I do for concealed carry classes, because most instructors will teach, even attorneys will say, this is what the standard is, this is when you can pull a firearm, this is when you can use deadly force. But I think it's more beneficial to the students sometimes to use real-world examples of what could happen in that gray area. And the gray area is what's not being taught. So I end up creating a seminar that I've taught in different venues called When Not to Pull a Firearm. I've taught it at the Ohio Tactical Officers Association's conference. I've taught it some private legal seminars. I have one coming up on April 3rd, I think, or April 7th at Blackwing Shooting Center. I'm going to be teaching the same thing.
Excellent. And I think Ohio also has a duty to inform law, and it kind of brings up constitutional issues, but how do you advise people to deal with the duty to inform law when, while at the same time, I think as an defense attorney, you would say, avoid talking to the police. I don't mean to put words in your mouth.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's an interesting question. It's an argument I've actually made in court on multiple occasions. I've always got a plea deal after I make the argument. So it's never actually gotten litigated to the appellate level. But I do believe there's some constitutional issues from the Fifth Amendment standpoint with the duty to inform. In Ohio, we're one of a minority of states that requires that upon being stopped, and that's a legal term of art, but actually being stopped by a law enforcement officer, you have a duty to promptly inform the law enforcement officer that you are armed and have a concealed handgun license. The problem with it is it could lead to other evidence that would not have been maybe discovered of another crime. Let's say you have drugs in the car. You are high. Or let me back up. Let me use a different example because I've actually had this case happen. You're drunk. You get pulled over. You get out of the car. You announce you have a firearm on you. Well, that's a felony to be driving a car drunk with a gun, right? So what have you done? You've just given them evidence that, hey, I'm committing a felony. Otherwise, if they had never found the gun, they never had any evidence of the firearm, it would have just been a misdemeanor DUI. So that's an example. And there's some other arguments against that. That's just kind of a brief overview. But I do sincerely have a problem with the duty to inform in Ohio. I think it is problematic, and we've been working very diligently to try and remove it completely. There was a bill that was in the General Assembly last year. I think it was last year, and it was getting some traction. Then a counter bill came out that said, well, we'll leave it in place, but we're just going to reduce the penalty. Well, that doesn't resolve the constitutional issue.
Right.
So I had a real tough time swallowing that pill. They said, oh, it's just a traffic ticket. I'm like, it doesn't matter. It could lead to something more serious. That bill ended up not going anywhere. I think it might have been around the time of one of our horrific mass shootings or something, and the bill kind of stalled out and didn't end up getting passed.
So for the firearms industry, you mentioned exports. I think maybe a lot of listeners don't realize what's involved there. Can't people who have an FFL just manufacture firearms and send them to whoever wants to buy them?
No, there's a lot of different international treaties that you have to be aware of. You have to get a license and a permit to export certain firearms. Everything's got to be run through the federal government. Certain countries have embargoes, such as China. You can't import firearms from China or even their components, generally speaking. And certain other countries have certain prohibitions on certain things and not on other things. And it's actually quite regulated under a variety of different regulations and laws, and it can be very, very riddled with traps. Even some of the most sophisticated gun companies out there will find themselves making mistakes sometimes and getting themselves into issues where they have to call us to help them correct it, which we generally can do. It's never been a problem, but it's not like you just go to this one webpage and you can find all the rules and everything. It's a lot more complicated than that.
You mentioned the Chinese embargo, which I learned recently that I guess Canada is not part of, because those guys are flush with Chinese SKSs and they can't even bring them across the border to compete. Do you know what the origins of that were? And
yeah, if I remember correctly, and I'm not a history major or a boss by any stretch of the imagination. My undergraduate degree was in political science, but from my research, it looks like the embargo started during the Tiananmen Square incident, and then it was further added on after every president after that, starting with Bush Sr. and then going into the Clinton years or additional embargoes, and then going into the Bush Jr. years, Obama, and now into our current presidential administration.
So I always ask my guests if there are books that they recommend that gun owners should read, either about history or firearms or training. Any come to mind?
Well, from my standpoint as a gun lawyer, I think Stephen Halbrook, who's a colleague of mine out of Washington, D.C., kind of the godfather of gun law, if you will, has a great reference book out there called the Firearms Law Desk Reference. It's not the cheapest thing in the world, but if you're interested in firearms law and getting correct information, that's probably the best resource on the market.
Right. And I'll post links to munitionsgroup.com. Are there any other URLs I should put up on the show notes page?
You can link to our YouTube page. We get quite a following on YouTube. I think we have 32,000 followers or so. So that'd be helpful if you wanted to do that.
Okay. Yeah. What kind of things do you cover? I mean, I was watching a whole bunch of them this afternoon, but for the guys listening, what kind of things do you cover on there?
We cover everything, and it's actually expanding. It started years ago when I was a solo practitioner. I had a DVD company. I recorded the legal portion of the concealed carry course, and I would sell it to instructors. Well, YouTube was kind of blowing up at the time, and when that started taking hold, I realized I had to dissolve that company. It was a waste of money and time. So I invested my time in the YouTube, and so now instructors you can actually see the videos I first made from years ago. I look like I'm 10 years older than, and you can actually pull those up, and they're a little outdated because the laws have changed, but we talk about concealed carry quite a bit, about Ohio law quite a bit, but we're starting to branch out of that and getting into more of the industry side by bringing my law partner, Clay Cheshire, into it. You'll see us on film with Iraq Veteran 8888. We have a partnership that we market with him, and he's had us on his channel a couple times. So,
well, yeah, I will definitely post a link up there. For folks with carry licenses that have reciprocity with Ohio, anything they might want to be aware of when coming to your state?
Well, we have the notification law. So if you're stopped for a law enforcement purpose, and it only applies if you're armed, you have to promptly notify, and they don't define that word, so do it immediately. That's a big one. You can carry into bars, even if they serve as alcohol. You just can't drink or have drank to the point where you're under the influence before you enter the bar. That's a serious felony, so don't do that. But you're more than welcome to go into the bar unless they have a sign posted. You just cannot drink. So that's something that's kind of unknown in Ohio, because a lot of states require that the bar serve so much food and things like that. It's probably about it. Restaurant carry, do need to notify the two big ones when I travel that I always generally want to know. If you have a concealed handgun license, car carry, there is no restrictions on it, so to speak. You can carry the gun in your car how you would on your person. Doesn't apply to long guns. We don't have CCW licenses in Ohio. We have a CHL, so it only applies to handguns. It doesn't apply to knives, batons, and shotguns and long guns.
God. Oh, so are there pitfalls with other weapons? Like, I mean, long guns, but like knives and stuff like that. How are knife laws there?
Theoretically, yes. Generally, I've never seen. I had one client call me that was actually charged with this, and he never became a client. He kind of deserved it because he had an attitude with a police officer. But with knives, Ohio is very interesting because the law starts by saying it's against the law to carry a deadly weapon concealed on your person or about your person. So it really comes down to what the definition of deadly weapon is, and it's basically any instrument that's designed or can be readily made to inflict serious bodily harm or death. Well, I mean, that could be anything, right? That could be a pen.
Right. Yep.
And it for sure is a knife. So if you're carrying a pocket knife in your pocket, you're violating the law, at least on the face of it. I do remember years ago thinking I found some legislative notes that said it was not their intent to outlaw pocket knives, but those are legislative notes. Those are not binding anyway. So I've never seen anybody charged with it other than one client who called me for a consultation. He couldn't afford me, but he had said he was stopped for open carrying, and he copped an attitude with the police officers, and the officer found a knife in his pocket, so they charged him with that. And it is a CCW violation. So, yeah, he's open carrying a firearm. They don't charge him with that. They find the knife in his pocket. They charge him with that. So the laws can be a little bit cumbersome in the state of Ohio with regards to that, and there needs to be a movement, I think, to carve out a specific exception to pocket knives, maybe up to a certain blade length at the state level, but there just hasn't been done that. That has not occurred. And then knives, because they're not subject to our preemption statute in Ohio, it only applies to firearms, can be regulated by each city and village. So you have an array of different laws from city to city with different blade length requirements.
Oh, fun. Wow.
Yeah. Generally not enforced from what I've seen, especially if you're just carrying a pocket knife, but it's something to be aware of.
So I heard you mention that you guys work on restoring rights for felons. Can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, it's really where I cut my teeth and what I'm known nationally for. I'm going to be teaching at the NRA again this year, their annual seminar in Indianapolis. I've taught there twice before restoration. This year I'm actually teaching on the NICS system. But I have taught on restoration before nationally on a couple of occasions, and I've helped people in a variety of different states with this issue, and it's very state specific. We started taking away gun rights from people who were convicted of certain things, way back in, I can't remember the first disability, it might have been in the 40s or 50s. But the Gun Control Act, where it stands today, is we have a laundry list of 9 things that would cause it what we call a disability. When I say disability, I mean legal disability from owning or possessing firearms or ammunition. Body armor is only restricted from violent felons. It's not something I've really dealt a whole lot with. But with regards to firearms, those 9 things are if you have been convicted of a crime punished by more than a year in prison, generally what we think of as felonies. What's interesting about that in Ohio, we have a felony level that is not punishable by more than a year. It's punishable by exactly 1 year, and that's in felony 5. So it doesn't actually invoke the federal disability if you're convicted of it. So in fact, you can be convicted of a felony in Ohio and possess firearms. It just has to be a felony 5, non-violent, not drug-related. That's the most common one. The other most common one is domestic violence, and it's the Second Amendment is the only right that's been restricted by a misdemeanor conviction. And it's a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence, and it's the most difficult to fix. I could spend hours just trying to explain how it all works, but it doesn't have to be domestic violence proper. Where it gets really funky is there was a 2008 case from the Supreme Court where Justice Ginsburg, right from the majority court, basically held it doesn't have to say domestic violence. It just has to be an offense of violence where the victim was a family relation. So assault would work, disorderly conduct in certain states, menacing, stalking, something like that uses some words of violence in it. So It's not just domestic violence anymore. They basically have taken that term, they've broadened it. So in Ohio, for instance, the FBI takes a standpoint that domestic violence qualifies, assault qualifies, attempted assault qualifies, negligent assault may qualify, disorderly conduct qualifies in certain instances. So there's a slew of convictions, and what I find is defense attorneys who don't know any better are pleading their clients out to these things and telling their clients that their gun rights won't be lost, and then I have to step in after the fact and fix it. We had a client very recently hire us, and his attorney in another state had said, plead to this because he was charged with domestic violence. It won't affect your gun rights, and he does, and a month later, ATF shows up at his door. And so I'm looking at his file, and I'm like, well, your attorney was not right. He was wrong, and you have a malpractice case against him. We called the attorney, he yelled at us and told us we were malpracticing ourselves. Well, it turns out we were right. So we ended up fixing it for him. We got him another attorney who we were comfortable with in that state because we weren't licensed in that state, who was able to overturn that conviction based on the ineffective counsel that he got. And now it's at the point where we're encouraging him to file a lawsuit against his former attorney to get his money back. And the ATF took all his guns too. We're doing our best to get those back, but at the time they took them, he couldn't have them. So they have a legitimate right to take those guns. And if we can't get them back, that could kind of probably $10,000 worth of guns. He's going to be able to go after the attorney for that, I think, in my opinion. So,
right. And then there's that. That firearms not returned kind of, it's another disqualifier, right?
Well, what do you mean?
I thought that if you had firearms taken, pursuant to a domestic violence situation and they weren't returned, that even if you weren't convicted of anything related to domestic violence, that kept you from owning firearms in the future. So if they take his...
No, I don't, unless you're talking about like a protection order or something like that. I'm not really sure what you're referring to, but generally speaking with domestic violence, if you're convicted of it, you can never own the guns again. You maintain a pecuniary interest in them. There's some case law on that, financial interest in them, but you can't possess them. If there's a protection order, and oftentimes that's associated with domestic violence, even if you're not convicted because it's a civil action, that would prohibit you from possessing firearms. And in Ohio, those can only last up to 5 years. So maybe that's what you're referring to.
That might be. Okay. You mentioned there was 9 things, and I've always been thinking it was just those 2. What are the other 7?
There's if you've been adjudicated mentally defective, so mentally ill, that has to go through. You actually get adjudicated. That there's a whole court process that revolves around that process. What else? Renouncing your citizenship. Not just saying I'm done with the Democrats, I'm no longer a U.S. citizen, but actually filing the proper paperwork. Some Facebook CEOs did that to avoid taxes. What else? Dishonorably discharged from the United States military would be one. Let's see here. An important one nowadays. An unlawful user of a controlled substance. And what the listener should know is that marijuana, even if it's legal in your state, is still controlled by the U.S. government. And if you're using it, even if you're in compliance with state law, you're still violating federal law, and you've now just disqualified yourself from possessing firearms. So that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah. Wow. I thank you very much for being on the show. Any parting words for our listeners?
No, just if you have a question, just reach out to us. Never make an assumption in gun law. It always comes back to biting in the ass. So.
All right. Well, thank you very much for being on the show. I look forward to talking to you again soon.
All right. Have a good day, sir.
Thanks again for tuning in to episode 119 of the Out of Order Gun Rights Podcast. Show notes page for today's episode is outoforderjameskalita.com/119. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.